Welcome back everyone, my name is Kiz and we are here for our third introductory Akkadian class, this time covering adjectives and the verbal adjective. So we're going to be discussing the formation of adjectives as well as their grammatic and syntactic function in Akkadian, and then we'll take a closer look at the verbal adjective, its stem pattern and its potential uses in Akkadian. Now, if you haven't already, it's a really good idea to check out my previous two videos on introducing Akkadian and nouns in Akkadian so that you have a really solid foundation for understanding everything that we're going to be discussing here today, and so that you don't get lost in grammatical nuances. So with all that said, here is our adjectival paradigm. So first off, what is an adjective? An adjective is a describing word, so anything like brave, handsome, beautiful, wonderful, these are all examples of adjectives. Adjectives inflect for gender, number and case, just like our nouns do, and they also always agree with the nouns in gender, number and case, which they are qualifying. So if we take an example phrase here, Beatum Damkum, this translates as a beautiful or the beautiful house in Akkadian. You'll see our noun, Beatum here, this is the word for house, and it has, as you might be able to tell from our previous lesson, a nominative singular masculine suffix. And Damkum, this is our adjective for the word beautiful, is mirroring the suffix of the noun, and it is also inflected for nominative masculine singular. In terms of syntax, our adjectives always follow the nouns which they qualify, except in certain prosaic or poetic contexts where this can be inverted, or in fact in poetry it's not irregular for you to see even a verb between a noun and its qualifying adjective. So that's something to watch out for, but usually you'll always see your adjective following the noun. So that's it in terms of the basics, and we can move on to our adjectival paradigm. Conveniently enough, for memorization, this paradigm is actually almost identical to our nominal paradigm from last lesson, so there's nothing extra to learn here. All you need to bear in mind is that the masculine plural adjectival suffix is different from the nominal paradigm. So whereas we had lengthened u, I and I in the nominal paradigm, now we have utum, utim, utim. In terms of forming our adjectives, this is done in an identical way to the formation of nouns. So we take the lexical form of the adjective and we remove the mimation and the case vowel so that we can find the stem of the adjective, which in this case is dunk. And then onto our stem we can add any of our adjectival endings. So if we wanted a masculine plural ending, we could have utum, damkutum. Or if we wanted, say, a feminine plural ending in the accusative, we'd have damkatim. So that's all very straightforward. It works in parallel with the nominal formation, so there's nothing new to note there. In terms of nuances, some things you might want to note. Our feminine plural endings, you will sometimes see them written as atum with a lengthened e vowel, as opposed to the lengthened a vowel. This goes for nouns as well. So if a word is derived from an e verb, the most common e verb being apatium, this is the verb to do or to make, then any noun or adjective which is derived from this verb will take the e vowel as opposed to the lengthened a vowel. So the most common noun which derives from apatium is the word for work or deed. So if we put that into the feminine plural, it will form epshatum as opposed to epshatum. This is really just for ease of pronunciation, but it's a good thing to note this variation so that it doesn't trip you up in translation. Similarly, in terms of derivations from this standard paradigm, in 1500 BC, obviously we lose our mimation. The mimation falls out of use. So if you were translating a text from the first millennium BC, a standard Babylonian text, this paradigm would have to be changed so that the mimation was lost, but also to reflect the fact that the case system had fallen into some disarray somewhat. So our u, a and I vowels of the nominative, accusative and genitive had been scrapped, and the I vowel was being used indiscriminately to refer to all cases. So if you were reading a standard Babylonian tablet, the paradigm would look a little bit more like this, with our I vowel for the masculine, uti for the masculine plural, t for the feminine, and arti for the feminine plural. If you were reading an Assyrian tablet, so this would be for the Babylonian, in the north of Mesopotamia, where we have the Assyrian dialect, the I vowel of the ending would change to an E vowel. So you'd have ute and arte. Now these are sort of very specific nuances, but it's good that you're aware of them so that if you are translating a tablet, you understand that there can be some derivations which are based on the dialect that the tablet has been written in, where the tablet comes from, and the period in which the tablet was written. So moving on, you'll note from last lesson that we were looking at nouns and the different numbers that they can inflect for. So we have singular, plural, and dual, dual referring to pairs of things. You'll notice that we don't have a separate inflection for dual adjectives. So if you need to qualify a noun in the dual, you will use the feminine plural adjectival ending to qualify the noun in the absence of a specific dual inflection for adjectives. And moving on to our next point, there are no comparative or superlative forms in Akkadian. So in English, we use suffixes such as these to indicate comparative and superlative forms. So for example, an adjective would be a word like bright. If we wanted to turn that into a comparative form, we would use the word brighter, with the ER ending there, indicating comparative. And the superlative form would be brightest. However, in Akkadian, we don't use suffixes to indicate comparative and superlative in this way. We use prepositions. So for the comparative form, we use the preposition eli, which translates as than. And for superlative, we use the preposition ina, which translates best as among. So if we were to use two exemplary phrases to demonstrate this phenomena, if you wanted to say something was greater or better than something else in Akkadian, you could use a phrase like eli anim Rabbi. This means greater than this one, with the preposition at the front, anim meaning this one or this, and Rabbi great or greater in the context. And to indicate a superlative, this is quite a standard phrase that you will see quite a lot, referencing deities. Ina ili karabta. And this translates as most heroic among the gods. Among the gods, most heroic. So you might notice actually with adjectives of dimension in general, these are words such as big, small, etc., that when they move into their plural forms, they take their second root consonant doubles. So if we take this adjective here, Rabbi, in its lexical form it will be rabu, that's a masculine nominative singular form, and then when it moves into its plural, you will notice that the second root consonant doubles as we move into the masculine nominative plural, rabutum. In terms of irregulars, there aren't too many things to note for adjectives. However, there are some nouns whose meaning is so intertwined with adjectival interpretation that they end up taking adjectival suffixes as opposed to nominal ones. The most common word that does this is etlum, which is the word for young man. So you can see here, this is a masculine singular noun in the nominative form, but when it moves into a plural form, it will take an adjectival masculine ending. It could be that these nouns had their origins in adjectives, and that's why they do this, but for now we're not sure, so we just say that these are irregular words, and it's something to be on the lookout for. And finally, before we move on to our last section, which is verbal adjectives, I want to highlight something which is really important, and that's namely that adjectives can sometimes be used as nouns. So don't throw your grammar books out the window. Let me make an example to explain from a really simple adjective, like the adjective for good, taboo. Now this can be translated as good, but it could also be translated as a good man. And similarly, its feminine equivalent, tabtu, could be translated as good, or it could be translated as a good woman. And feminine adjectives are also frequently used to refer to abstract nouns. So tabtu could be used to refer to good, a good woman, or even goodness. So that is something to bear in mind, and we only have context to decide which translation is most befitting of the context. So moving on to our second section, we're going to be taking a look at verbal adjectives. First, I'll explain what verbal adjectives are, how to form them, and how we translate them. And then we'll take a look at some examples from transliteration and also from the Cuneiform text. Now, first off, if you think back to our first lesson, you'll remember that words like nouns, adjectives, verbs, participles, etc. in Akkadian are all formed from a three-root consonant base, which is indicated by this square root bracket here. Now, essentially, all words in Akkadian are formed by inserting specific patterns of vowels to this three-root consonant base. In other words, the base has a foundational meaning, and depending on which stem pattern has been applied to it, the meaning can be changed. So, having said that, the stem pattern for our verbal adjective is parsum. You'll note that almost universally in grammar books, the same verb is used to indicate the whole verbal paradigm. That's the verb parasum, whose interpretation is to cut off or to keep away. And in all of the examples which follows, the capitalized consonants are representing the three root consonants, and the vowels are what is indicating the difference in meaning. So this is our stem pattern for the verbal adjective. So what are verbal adjectives? Verbal adjectives essentially have similarities both with verbs and with adjectives. So the best way to demonstrate this with an English phrase would be with a phrase like a demonstrable fact. So you'll note how the word demonstrable is deriving from the verb to demonstrate, but it's qualifying the adjective in a way that you might expect, it's qualifying the noun, sorry, in a way that you might expect an adjective to qualify a noun. And when a word is used in this way, and it is inflected into the verbal adjective stem pattern, we call it a verbal adjective. So if we take another example, say from a different verb this time, like patarum, to release. So the root consonants of that verb are P, T, and R. And if we put this verb into our verbal adjective stem pattern, we would get patrum. So note how our consonants are in the same positions as with our example here, and our vowels are mimicking the vowels of the verbal adjective stem pattern. And this word here would translate as released, as a passive verb. It's important to note that all of our adjectives inflect according to the verbal adjective stem pattern. So if you think back to all of the adjectives that we've looked at so far, like damcum, the adjective for beautiful, you can see how this is following this verbal adjective stem pattern. Or if we take another example like captum, this is the adjective for heavy. It's following the same stem pattern. So with that in mind, I want to be really clear about the distinction between an adjective and a verbal adjective, as sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish between the two in form. An adjective is something which is translated as such, right? An adjective would be translated as beautiful. But if it's being used as a verbal adjective, the translation would be a verb of being, so to be beautiful. And this is really grammatically significant because only intransitive verbs, verbs which don't take a direct object, can be translated as a verb of being. Whereas intransitive verbs, verbs which need a direct object, verbs like apatium or, as we met previously, patarum, to release, they need to be translated as passive participles when they go into the verbal adjective stem pattern. So, in summary, our verbal adjective stem pattern looks like this. It declines as an adjective, and when it is being, when an intransitive verb is applied to it, it can be translated as a verb of being or as a simple adjective. But when a transitive verb is applied, it needs to be interpreted as a passive verb. So with that said, let's look at some more examples of transitive verbs going into the verbal adjective stem pattern and being translated as a passive. So if we take an example of the verb to seize, which is sabatum, here are the three root consonants, and then if we put this into our verbal adjective stem, we'd get sabtum, and this would translate as seized. Or if we take another example like kanakam, the verb to seal. The root letters are K and K, and in the stem pattern it would look like cancum, and this would translate as sealed, so on and so forth. Now, the final thing to note before we go on to our cuneiform examples is that although our stem pattern is parsum, it actually derives from an earlier form of the stem pattern, which is parvsum, where an indiscriminate vowel is added between the R and the S root consonants. Now, this vowel always elides, it disappears when any suffix beginning with a vowel is added onto the end, hence why we only ever see it looking like parsum. However, occasionally, as is the case with the feminine T suffix, the suffix does actually begin with a consonant, and when that's the case, the V vowel comes back. And it comes back so that we can avoid a consonant cluster of 3 consonants together, which Akkadian doesn't really like. So we can see this with the adjective rapsham. Rapsham is the adjective for wide, and in the masculine singular, where the suffix begins with a vowel, you can see that it's following the parsum verbal adjective stem pattern as normal. However, if you wanted to put this into its feminine form, and thereby the suffix would be beginning with the T consonant, the A vowel, in this case, needs to be added, inserted between the second and third root consonants. And this is to avoid the P, the sheen and the T all being clustered together and making the word sort of impronounceable to an Akkadian. Now that we've made it through both sections, adjectives and verbal adjectives, using any notes which you've made on stem patterns and adjectival declensions, we're going to see if we can decline any of these cuneiform examples. So, starting with transliteration, and the top one here, we have the phonetic value sha, followed by ak, followed by nu, and So, first things first, we can see that we have 3 consonants here which represent our root consonants. So, sheen, k, and n are our root consonants, and these form the verb shakanam, which is to put. Now, we can see that our vowels are reflective of that of the verbal adjective, and we know that shakanam is a transitive verb. It needs a direct object, so it should be translated as a passive. So in this case, shaknum will be translated as put or placed in the passive participle. Moving on to our next example, we have the value tsa, followed by ab, followed by tum. And this is actually leading on from an example which we saw in transcription during the lesson, the root vowels being the S, the B, and the T. Now, you could be deceived into thinking that this was a feminine nominal adjectival ending, but because we know that this is deriving from the verb sabatum, which is a transitive verb, it is a verbal adjective which needs to be translated as a passive. So in this instance, this is being translated as seized from the verb sabatum to seized, to seize. And thirdly, we have this piece here, which will translate as ra, pa, ash, and the same sign that we've seen up here, tum. And this has 2 possible meanings. We have our 3 root consonants here, r, p, and sheen, and our feminine ending here. So we know that this is using the feminine nominative singular adjectival suffix, and it could translate as wide in the adjectival sense, or it could be working as an abstract noun, in which case it would be translated as width. Because we're lacking context here, it could be either or. And finally, our last example is this one at the bottom, and I thought I'd reintroduce logograms from our previous lesson. So we have the logograms e and gal. And the the Akkadian transcription for this is ekolum, and this is the word for palace. So these two are logograms for the word palace. Literally, it would translate as big house, as a point of interest. And then we have the phonograms ra, bu, and u. So this translates as the big house or the grand house, with our adjective here at the end, rabu, inflected for the masculine nominative singular. And because this is a weak adjective, the u phonogram has been repeated at the end to indicate that it is a weak, it's ending in a weak vowel. So it would be transcribed as such here with a circumflex on top. Well, congratulations on making it this far through both of our sections. I know it can be tedious to make your way through all of the grammar, however, trust me, it's 100% worth it when you realise how much further along your translation journey it's taken you, and that you're able to read straight from the cuneiform yourself. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.